Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission here is always to take these huge, complex moments in history and really distill them down into what you need to know.
And today, we are diving into a period that Winston Churchill himself called the hard and heavy tidings of early 1942.
It's just an incredibly shocking, rapid period of collapse for the Allies. It completely redefined the war in just a few months.
It really did. We've pulled together sources on the Japanese advance, how the U.S. got entangled on two fronts at once, and of course the big one, the devastating consequences of the fall of Singapore.
The Gibraltar of the East, that's what they called it. And Churchill, who wasn't exactly known for understatement, described its surrender as the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history.
I mean, that's an incredible statement.
It's a staggeringly high bar for failure.
It is, and we're going to unpack how the unthinkable really happened. The numbers alone are just, well, they're staggering. You're talking 80,000 prisoners of war taken in Singapore.
And that's on top of another 50,000 captured just before in the Malayan campaign.
Exactly. This wasn't just a military loss. It was a psychological shockwave that, you could argue, ended an entire era of colonial power.
Okay, so let's get into it. Let's unpack this enormous disaster, starting with the engine that was really powering this whole Japanese offensive.
To really get this, you have to put yourself in the Japanese military mindset. For them, this war didn't just kick off in 1939 with Europe.
Right, this had been building for a long time.
A long time. Their documents call it the Greater East Asia War, and its roots go all the way back to the invasion of Manchuria in 1931.
So this wasn't just opportunism, seeing Europe distracted. This was a sustained, decade-long project.
Precisely. It was driven by these deep economic and demographic pressures. Japan was this modern industrial nation, but it was also a tiny island trying to feed 65 million people.
That's a population density similar to modern Britain, right?
Roughly, yes. So their leadership felt this existential need to secure bigger markets and, most critically, raw materials.
And they were pretty open about the fact they were modeling themselves on the West.
Oh, absolutely. That's the bitter irony here. The sources show they saw themselves as simply copying what Britain had done a century before, building a self-sufficient empire.
To fuel their industry, support their population.
Exactly. But the real wealth, the rubber, the tin, and especially the oil, that was all held by the old, stretched thin European powers, the French in Indochina, the Dutch in the East Indies, the British in Malaya.
And with those powers fighting for their lives against Hitler, the window of opportunity was wide open. But the real trigger, the thing that forced Japan's hand, was an economic move from the U.S.
That's the pivot point. July 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt enforces a full oil embargo on Japan.
And the impact was immediate.
It was catastrophic. The figures we have confirmed Japan lost just a shattering 93% of its oil supply overnight.
93%. That's not an inconvenience. That's strangulation.
Complete strangulation. It meant their entire Imperial Navy would be immobile within, what, 18 months?
Yeah.
2 years max. They were also cut off from American scrap metal, which they needed for their steel mills. And to make it worse, the Dutch government in exile joined the embargo, breaking their oil treaty for the East Indies.
So Japan is starved of oil and metal, and they're facing this impossible choice.
It's a stark choice. Either you pull back from China, you lose face, you accept slow economic death, or you launch a massive, desperate gamble to seize the resources you need.
Which were all in the South Pacific.
The Dutch East Indies oil fields. That decision made war inevitable.
But to get that oil, you have to sail thousands of miles south, right into a theater where the U.S. Pacific Fleet could cut every single one of your supply lines.
And that brings us to the strategic necessity of Pearl Harbor. To get the oil, you have to neutralize the only force that can stop you.
The U.S. Navy.
But there was an even more immediate threat. The American bases in the Philippines, particularly on the island of Luzon.
Because Luzon sits right in the middle of that supply corridor.
It's the choke point. Our sources are clear on this. Every oil tanker sailing from Borneo or Sumatra back to Japan had to pass right by American-held territory. The bombers based there were a lethal threat.
So the Philippines had to be knocked out at the same time as the fleet.
Simultaneously. It was all part of one single, massive strategic imperative for economic survival.
Which leads directly to that audacious strike on December 7th, 1941. I mean, we can't overstate the shock of Pearl Harbor. It was designed to buy them 6 months of freedom in the Pacific.
Roosevelt's date, which will live in infamy. And it meant the immediate end of American isolationism. Congress voted for war on Japan the very next day, December 8th.
But the really critical thing here is how quickly this regional war becomes truly global, and that's thanks to a decision made 5,000 miles away.
In Europe, this is where the Pacific War and the European War, which had totally different origins,
Yeah.
become tangled together forever.
And the man responsible for tying that knot was Adolf Hitler.
It was. On December 11th, 1941, Germany and Italy declare war on the United States. And you have to ask why. The Japanese had pulled off their attack without any help, and Hitler had no navy to offer them anyway.
So was it just ideological loyalty, part of the tripartite pact?
It seems to have been a monumental strategic error. He just grossly underestimated America's industrial power. And he had this mistaken belief that declaring war would force Roosevelt to divert supplies away from Russia, which was bleeding Germany dry on the Eastern Front.
But what it actually did was force America's hand completely.
Absolutely. It guaranteed a two-front war for the Axis. Even if some Americans wanted to focus only on Japan, Hitler made sure that the world's two greatest industrial powers, America and the Soviet Union, were now completely aligned against him.
While all these diplomatic decisions are being made in Berlin, the physical assault by Japan is just spreading like a tidal wave.
The speed is incredible. They hit everywhere at once to paralyze the Western powers.
The list of targets is just staggering.
The Philippines, Wake Island, Guam, Midway gets shelled, airfields in Malaysia, Clark Field in the Philippines.
And of course, Hong Kong, the citadel of British imperialism in China.
Right. Hong Kong was never expected to hold out for long, but the defense was incredibly fierce. 6,000 defenders, British, Canadian, Indian, held off 40,000 Japanese.
They only surrendered on Christmas Day, right?
When the Japanese finally seized the colony's reservoirs, that was the first major group of Allied prisoners. But like I said, that was just the appetizer. The real prize was Singapore.
Okay, let's get into the psychology of this. The British belief that Singapore was invincible. It wasn't just confidence, it was basically dogma.
It was deeply ingrained, especially by Churchill himself. He had been First Lord of the Admiralty in 1940, overseeing its defenses. The whole plan was that the main Royal Navy fleet would sail from Europe and use Singapore as its base.
And this faith was based on those huge coastal guns.
The massive 15-inch guns. They were convinced those guns made the island impregnable from the sea. Churchill believed it would take a siege by an army of at least 50,000 men. He thought the Japanese were a prudent people and would never try such a mad enterprise.
He was completely dismissive of an attack from the land.
Totally. And that overconfidence was shattered almost immediately by the sinking of 4C.
This is such a pivotal moment in military history.
It really is. Churchill sent the pride of the fleet, HMS Prince of Wales, a brand new battleship, and HMS Repulse.
Yeah.
They were meant to be this powerful naval deterrent.
But they had no air cover. The aircraft carrier that was supposed to go with them, HMS Indomitable, had run aground.
And that lack of air cover was fatal. Just 3 days after Pearl Harbor, 4Z was found by 86 Japanese aircraft. And this wasn't just a skirmish. This was the end of the battleship era.
The unsinkable deterrent was sunk by torpedo bombers.
In a single action, within hours, the entire Malayan coast was exposed. The main naval defense for the whole region was just gone.
And with the seas wide open, General Yamashita begins his relentless 54-day campaign down the peninsula. The famous bicycle blitz.
The British had just completely underestimated them. They assumed the dense jungle would be a natural barrier, forcing the Japanese onto the roads.
But the Japanese were masters of jungle warfare.
They were tactically brilliant. They had superior air support, great coordination with their armor, and they were trained for this kind of light, rapid movement.
So how did the bicycles actually work? Was it really an army on bikes?
In a way, yes. It was symbolic of their logistical genius. They could cover incredible distances, maybe 60 miles a day. They'd ride the bikes, ditch them to fight, and then jump onto captured British trucks when the roads opened up. They just kept outflanking the Allies, forcing one retreat after another.
They never gave the British time to set up a proper defensive line.
Never. And so by early February, the Allies are pushed back onto Singapore Island itself. They're exhausted, demoralized, and they're convinced the Japanese are this unstoppable force.
Which brings us to the most incredible part of the whole siege, Yamashita's bluff.
It's an unbelievable gamble. Yamashita confessed later his entire attack on Singapore was a bluff. He only had about 30,000 men, and they were tired.
And he was facing nearly 100,000 Allied personnel.
He was outnumbered more than 3-1. His supply lines were stretched thin. He knew if the siege dragged on, his weakness would be exposed.
So he had to project overwhelming strength.
Exactly. He was, in his own words, very frightened all the time that the British would discover our numerical weakness. He needed surrender, and he needed it at once.
So he launched this massive air and artillery attack on the northwest coast, a huge assault on February 8th.
After a clever feint to the northeast to draw away reserves. And this is where that famous, frustrating failure of the big coastal guns comes in.
They could turn inland, couldn't they?
They could, but they were useless. They were supplied almost entirely with armor-piercing shells designed to punch through the hulls of warships.
Not high-explosive shells for use against infantry.
They had next to none. The dogma that the attack could only come from the sea meant the fortress was logistically unarmed against the threat that actually showed up. It's just a catastrophic failure of imagination.
Yeah. As the Japanese pushed forward, the British command just fractures. Percival's forces are running low on everything.
The fighting was desperate. We read about the Malay regiment fighting hand-to-hand after running out of ammunition. But once the Japanese seized the reservoirs and cut the water supply, it was over.
The whole city was facing a humanitarian catastrophe.
Which forced Percival's hand. And so, on February 15th, 1942, he surrendered. He walked under a white flag to meet Yamashita at the Ford Motor Company factory.
What a symbolic location.
The Japanese immediately renamed the city Shonan, Light of the South. But the aftermath was brutal. Of the 50,000 captured white troops, 18,000 would die in captivity over the next 3 years.
And beyond the human cost, the sources all stress the political fallout. This was the moment the myth of European superiority in Asia was just shattered.
Absolutely shattered. While that was happening, the Americans were losing their own major possession, the Philippines, in equally disastrous circumstances.
The sources paint such a vivid picture of the pre-war Philippines. Officers playing golf, social events, a comfortable imperial outpost.
A comfort zone that was geographically impossible to defend. It was 8,000 miles from the U.S., but only 200 miles from Japanese-held Formosa.
And General MacArthur's force was tiny for the task.
Laughably small. About 16,000 U.S. regulars, 12,000 elite Philippine scouts, and a lot of untrained, badly equipped local militia.
And there was this fatal overconfidence in technology, particularly the B-17 bomber.
Both MacArthur and General Marshall back in Washington thought a handful of B-17s could act as a deterrent.
A mistake that was punished almost immediately.
Instantly. Just hours after Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers struck Clark Field and caught most of the U.S. Air Force on the ground. They achieved total air supremacy in a day.
Which is the kiss of death.
With no air cover, MacArthur knew he couldn't hold the beaches. He executed a planned withdrawal to the Bataan Peninsula. The strategy was defense and delay.
Use the jungle terrain, shorten the lines, and deny the Japanese the port of Manila Bay.
And they held out for 4 months, which was a significant delay. It probably saved Australia. But the conditions on Bataan were just horrific.
I can't even imagine.
The peninsula was horribly overcrowded with over 100,000 troops and civilians. Food ran out almost immediately. Soldiers were eating monkeys to survive.
And disease was rampant.
Dysentery, malaria. Sickness was killing more men than the Japanese. It was a nightmare. But they held on until April.
By March, though, the writing was on the wall. And this is when MacArthur's ordered to leave.
It's pure Hollywood drama. Roosevelt orders him to Australia to set up a new command. On March 12th, he and his family escape on 4 motor torpedo boats.
And then they had to fly out.
On a B-17 that was basically cobbled together from spare parts, they flew for 5 hours over enemy-held islands, dodging 0 fighters. The Navy gave him a 1 in 5 chance of making it.
Incredible. And when he landed, he made that famous vow.
That defiant promise that became an instant rallying cry for the Allies. He declared, "I shall return." And he made good on that promise 2 years later.
So while the Allies are suffering these huge defeats, the Japanese are still pushing for the one thing that started it all, the oil.
Right. Their next target was the Dutch East Indies, Sumatra, Java, Timor. That's where the real prize was.
And this is where the Allies tried to set up that joint command, the HCA command.
American, British, Dutch, Australian. But the sources show it was a complete catastrophe from the start.
Why was it so doomed?
It was just unwieldy. The forces were from 4 different nations with different doctrines, no shared training, no coordinated air support. It was the definition of too little, too late.
And the collapse was just as fast as in Malaya.
Just as fast. The Japanese used their air and naval power to isolate the islands. The Allied fleet tried to fight back at the Battle of the Java Sea.
A gallant action, I think one source called it.
Gallant, but hopeless. Without aircraft carriers, they were annihilated. The Allied Navy in the region ceased to exist, and resistance collapsed.
So by early March, the Japanese had secured the oil. Their primary strategic goal was achieved.
It was. But they also needed to isolate other threats. Which brings us to the importance of Burma.
Burma was critical for two big reasons, right?
Two massive reasons. First, it had its own resources, oil and rubber. But the second reason was strategic for the Americans, the Burma Road.
The only overland supply route left to get supplies to the Chinese nationalist forces fighting Japan.
And American strategy was banking on China tying down huge numbers of Japanese troops, so closing that road was a top priority for Japan.
And the defense of Burma went about as well as the defense of Malaya.
It was a similar story. The Japanese used the jungle to their advantage, bypassed British defenses, and took Rangoon, the only port, in early March.
So they successfully cut China's land link to the Allies.
A huge strategic blow. It forced the U.S. into that incredibly dangerous operation of flying supplies the hump over the Himalayas for the rest of the war.
It's just staggering to think about all of this happening at the same time. And what really defines this as a world war is the other world-altering events happening in parallel.
That simultaneity is key. While Singapore is falling, the Axis powers are showing the total nature of their commitment, not just to territory, but to ideology.
Let's start with the horror being formalized in Germany.
On January 20th, 1942, almost exactly a month before Singapore fell, the Wannsee Conference was held in Berlin. And this wasn't to decide if Jews would be murdered. That was already decided.
This was about the logistics, the practicalities of mass murder.
Exactly. Reinhard Heydrich and Adolf Eichmann met with senior Nazi officials to create the administrative blueprint for the final solution: how to track, transport, and exterminate 11 million people.
Using the full technical resources of the German state.
The railways, everything. We have Goebbels' diary entries from the time. He wrote that the Fuhrer was determined to clear the table, and that the destruction of the Jews was a necessary consequence of the war. The industrial-scale murder began right after this meeting.
The juxtaposition is just chilling. Clinical evil being planned in Berlin while armies are collapsing in the tropics.
And at that very moment on the Eastern Front, Germany was learning the limits of its own power at Leningrad.
The 900-day siege. How were people surviving there in early 42?
The conditions were inhuman, especially in that brutal winter. There was no fuel, no electricity. People were burning their furniture, their floorboards, just to stay warm.
And the death toll from starvation and cold was immense.
Over 200,000 deaths in just January and February. The body just can't survive that cold without food. And yet, somehow, the city's war industries kept working.
That's where the famous Road of Life comes in.
The only lifeline. Convoys of trucks racing across frozen Lake Ladoga, bringing in food and fuel and taking out civilians. It was constantly under German fire, but it represented this incredible Russian will to resist.
And while Russia was holding on, America was finally arriving in Europe.
The first U.S. troops since World War I landed in Northern Ireland, beginning the buildup.
Which created a massive culture shock for the British.
A huge one. The U.S. War Department even issued a handbook to help. It had that wonderful line, "The British don't know how to make a good cup of coffee. You don't know how to make a good cup of tea. It's an even swap."
I love that. But the arrival of these rich relations, as they were called, had a real economic impact.
Oh, absolutely. The GIs had unrationed butter, bacon, sugar, and they had things that were almost mythical in Britain, like chewing gum and nylon stockings. It created all sorts of social tensions.
But back on the American home front, the reaction to the war in the Pacific was much darker.
The fear on the West Coast was acute, but it was built on this long-standing resentment, especially from California farmers against immigrant labor.
And the rhetoric escalated fast.
California's Attorney General, Earl Warren, called Japanese Californians the Achilles heel of the entire civilian defense effort.
Which led directly to that terrible executive order.
On February 19, 1942, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. It authorized the roundup and evacuation of 120,000 Japanese Americans.
2/3 of whom are U.S. citizens.
Forced from their homes, their businesses, and sent to 10 internment camps. It's a dark stain on American history. The sources are careful to stress these were nothing like Nazi concentration camps, but it shows how fear can lead democracies to abandon their principles.
So despite all these disasters, the foundations for the fight back were being laid. In the air war against Germany, there was a major shift.
Driven by Churchill's belief that only the RAF can win the war, this led to the appointment of Air Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris.
A very forceful, very controversial figure.
And he had this absolute conviction that mass bombing could win the war on its own.
And his arrival came at the same time as new technology, the Lancaster bomber and a new navigation device.
Yes, the G navigation system. It used radio pulses to let bombers triangulate their position at night with much greater accuracy. Before G, night bombing was basically guesswork.
So this technology enabled a whole new doctrine.
The doctrine of area saturation bombing. The goal was no longer to hit a single factory. It was to destroy the morale and infrastructure of an entire city.
And we see the results right away with the firebombing of Lübeck, then Essen, Cologne.
The war was now coming directly to the German homeland. But back in the Pacific, the Japanese were still pressing their advantage, looking south to Australia.
Australia's Pearl Harbor, the raid on Darwin.
February 19th, the same day as the internment order, 188 Japanese planes descended on Darwin. They actually dropped more bombs there than they did on Pearl Harbor.
It was a critical Allied base, but it was completely unprepared.
Totally. 8 ships sunk, including the USS Perry. The Australian government was so scared of mass panic that they suppressed the casualty figures for years.
But there's a huge historical irony in that attack.
A profound one. The 4 Imperial aircraft carriers that hit Darwin were the same ones that hit Pearl Harbor. They were the most powerful naval force on the planet.
And within 4 months,
all 4 of them would be at the bottom of the Pacific, sunk at the Battle of Midway. Japan's easy ride was about to come to a very abrupt end.
So even in these darkest early months, you can see the tide beginning to turn. American troops are landing in New Caledonia, building bases.
Exactly. Plans were already being made for the invasion of Guadalcanal. The great sea battles of the Coral Sea and Midway were just on the horizon. The shift from defense to offense was beginning.
What an unbelievably dense and frankly brutal period of history. When you just list the events, Singapore Falls, the Philippines retreat, the Wannsee Conference, Leningrad starving it, hammers home what World War actually means.
The sheer velocity of it all, in just 2 or 3 months, completely remade the map. The Japanese victories were stunning, but they all hinged on exploiting the Allies' profound weaknesses.
So what's the deepest lesson we can take from this period of collapse?
I think the sources show that the fall of Singapore was more than a military defeat. It was the symbolic death of colonialism. It was the moment nationalist movements across Asia saw that the old European powers were not this unbeatable force they had believed.
That's a great point.
So it raises a question for you to think about. How much of Japan's success was pure military genius, the bicycle blitz, the air power, and how much was just successfully exploiting the rotten political and logistical structures of the old empires? That whole colonial decline was signaled right there in that Ford factory in Singapore.
A really profound thought to end on. It highlights those long-term consequences that go so far beyond the battlefield. Thank you for joining us for this incredibly detailed deep dive into the shocking start of 1942.
A pleasure.
If you want to support our channel and help us keep bringing you these deep dives into fascinating moments in history, be sure to check out our War Stories merch. You can find the shop link right there in the description below.
We'll see you next time.